This chapter covers the topic government budget and the economy. Very important topic for you to understand how the government runs the country in terms of its financial decisions. In the last chapter, we saw that the change in the consumption and investment shifted the economy to a higher GDPs, and we saw using the Keynesian model of aggregate demand and planned production process, right, how the economy's GDP shifts. Now we will see how the government uses these models to impact the economy to a great extent. So Indian economy is a mixed economy where the government enterprises are also there, and also we have private sector enterprises. So one of the biggest influences is the government's decisions on finances, on taxation, on expenditure, so on. And these decisions are very critical to ensure that the economy runs in the right direction. So in this chapter we look at broadly the components of a budget. Then we talk about balanced surplus and deficit budgets. Then we'll talk about how the government uses something called as fiscal policy, right? In the earlier case, we looked at monetary policy, where the Reserve Bank of India tweaked the interest rates, tweaked the bank rates, and all of them in order to ensure that there's money supply in the market, which enables credit growth and hence growth in the economy. The government also does its own bit by looking at the taxation expenditure in order to accelerate the economy. Economy को थोड़ा जोर देने के लिए government भी अपना अपना decisions करता है. That's called as fiscal policy. Then how do you manage deficits and how do you manage debts? So these are the broad themes that we look at. Now in the first place we must understand what is a budget. All of you know कि जब budget की बात करते हैं सब अपने घर में भी budget की बात करते हैं. We look at what is the salaries, what is the expenditure. We'll see whether these two are able to map each other or not. We would definitely not like to spend more than what we earn. I think these are the simple things that we do in a family. Imagine doing this for the entire country. That's exactly what the role of the government is in terms of presenting the budget to the public. Now in the constitution, nowhere in the constitution does the word budget appear, right? So budget appears as what is called as an annual financial statement. So this is how it appears in the article 112 of the constitution, and the responsibility for ensuring that the finance minister presents the budget to the parliament is actually the president of India, not the prime ministers. So it is under the authority of the president and with the direction from the president that the finance minister presents the budgetary document, which is the annual financial statement, to the parliament for discussion. Now normally पहले ये होता था कि we used to do the budget on February 28th. Now for the last since the time the BJP government has come to power, you see that the budget is being presented on February 1st. The February 28th logic was very simple. That was the date that British used to present the budget. We continued for that for almost about so many years, right, after Parliament. And it used to be presented at 3:30 in the afternoon, which coincides with about 10 o'clock, the office timings of the British government. So it didn't make sense. Of course, what we have now is it is presented on February 1st. It also gives the time for the entire departments to set their accounts right, so that from the next financial year, which is April 1st onwards, a lot of the budgetary proposals come into picture. So it gave a little more leeway, and in that sense it's a little better that budget is presented on February 1st. Now in this budgetary document or in this budget presentation, what are the things that are actually presented by the finance minister? एक तो है कि estimated receipts, कितने पैसे आने वाला है, कितने पैसे खर्च करने वाले हैं, right? That is expenditure. Then we talk about what are the reports. One is about what I am as a finance minister proposing that we spend in the next year, which is, suppose we are talking about this particular year, February 1st this year, We are talking about the presentation, the proposal for the next year. What is happening in the current year, not a full scale but the estimates, and what is the actuals in the previous year. So it actually is a document that gives an idea of 3 years, not just 1 year. It gives you an idea of 3 years. Then in the budget there's a document, as a part of the budget, in the parliament also there is a bill that is introduced called a finance bill, which basically talks about what are the tax proposals that are included in the budget, and this bill has to be discussed with the parliament and approved by it. Then the impact of the budget, right, is not just for this financial year. So whatever the decisions are taken by the government this year, it will have its impact. इसका जो effect है वो, I mean it could be very long term, कि 10 साल के बाद भी हो सकता है या कभी 2 साल तक हो सकता है. So we see that the budget effect is not just for this current year, right, the year that that starts from April 1st, but it could also be a little longer duration. So the proposals are put into broadly 2 things. One is called as a short-term revenue account, right? Short-term, typically in the accounting process, taxes, vexes, in sab ke liye, we take 2 to 3 years as a short-term, and long-term is something that is beyond that. So all these accounts, all the proposals are put into short-term and long-term, and the short-term is called as a revenue account and the long-term is called as a capital account. It's very similar to what we talk about capital spending in the case of expenditures. Same thing, the same process or same meaning is attached to what we use here. What are the main objectives of the budget? Budget का objectives क्या है? Broadly 3 objectives है. एक है allocation, दूसरा है redistribution, तीसरा है stabilization. So what do we mean by allocation? Allocation is government has to decide कि public goods के लिए कितना spend करना है. Public goods are goods that are things that all of us can use, and it is private good is when it's a contract between a person and a company or private owner, and so that's a private good, or somebody who's selling it and somebody who is buying it. Whereas in the case of public good like street lighting, roads, you name healthcare facilities for some people, right? So these are referred as public goods. So public goods benefits all, and the market mechanism fails. Hence the government has to come and then spend money and do expenditure on public goods. Public goods are non-rivalrous, right? इसका जो characteristic of public good है compared to private good, non-rivalrous. इसका मतलब अगर मैंने public good को use किया है, right, it doesn't take away, it does not reduce what you would get. For example, street lighting. I am using street lighting. Does that take away anything that you would get as in terms of street lighting? No, it doesn't. I use the road. Does it reduce the amount of road that you get? It doesn't. So that is called as non-rivalrous. Second चीज जो है, that is non-excludable, right? You cannot say कि आप public good को use नहीं कर सकते हो. Even if I don't pay anything, which is called as free riders, right? Even the free riders can use the public good because you cannot exclude anybody from this. Defense, right? Police force, all these come under your public goods. Roads, right? You cannot say कि आपने पैसे, you have not paid for this, hence you cannot use it. So this is called as non-excludable. The second is critical thing is redistribution of wealth. One of the important things that government has to ensure is कि there's equality or as much of equality as possible in the society, right? There should not be too much of a difference between the poor and the rich. So there's a little bit of balancing that must be done. So you take the money from the rich and try to give it to the poor, or provide services to the poor. Take this resources and provide services to the poor at subsidized rate, or it could be even free. So these are different ways the government tries to redistribute the income. And what is the main way to do that? It uses tax policies to do that. So the tax policies is very, very critical part of the budget document. Then we have stabilization. Stabilization is in terms of the economy. Economy को कैसे stabilize करें? Economy में जो two very important things that government has to ensure is employment and prices. So the fluctuations in employment and prices is something that the government must take care of. You would want to provide or create conditions जहाँ पे there is employment for as many number of people or so employment is need not be just only of human resources, but it is also a lot of other resources that are available. So whenever you refer to fully employed economy, or we are saying that all the resources that are possible in the economy are being used to the maximum possible extent. तो वो employment की बात है. तो अंडर एम्प्लॉयमेंट हो सकता है इकोनॉमी या ओवर एम्प्लॉयमेंट हो सकता है, राइट? अगर अंडर एम्प्लॉयमेंट है, यू वुड वांट टू एक्सपेंड द इकोनॉमी, यू वुड वांट मोर डिमांड टू बी क्रिएटेड, तो वी गवर्नमेंट विल डू टेक सम स्टेप्स दैट मेक्स द इकोनॉमी एक्सपेंशनरी, राइट? एक्सपेंड, इकोनॉमी के एक्सपेंड करेंगे, डिमांड बढ़ेगा और जो अंडर एम्प्लॉयड रिसोर्सेज है वो सब एम्प्लॉय हो जाएंगे. ओवर एम्प्लॉयमेंट होने से आई थिंक यू विल फाइंड दैट there's a lot possibility of demand shortages, right? So everybody is asking for more. It could be more labor force, it could be more resources that are needed. So there is general tendency for there to be higher inflation. So in such cases, the government will take steps to cool down the economy. So right, we say that steps to cool down the economy. The other thing is fluctuations, as I said, prices. Prices, we have to make sure that there is always going to be fluctuations, but it has to be within a certain band that is approved by the RBI, right? Or RBI is going to take a very close look at it. तो अगर prices बहुत ज़्यादा बढ़ रहे हैं, उसको हम कहते हैं inflationary economy. So government has to ensure, take steps to show that the inflation is not very high. Why? Because inflation hurts the people who are poor the most, right? I think it's also socially it is not very good in the economy, and so government will come in and put the make spending and ensure that the aggregate demand actually goes up or goes down. So aggregate, by shifting the aggregate demand, you will find that it is able to affect the employment, prices, and in this the government is the government spend is a very, very big influencer in how the economy moves. Now budget के broadly अगर आप देखोगे तो you could split the budget into, एक तो revenue budget है और दूसरा है capital budget. And revenue budget as I said, short term, capital budget long term. Revenue budget में दो चीज़ें हैं. So whenever we talking about budget, एक तो हम कहते हैं receipts, हाथ में कितना आ रहा है, expenditure, that is कितना आप खर्च कर रहे हो. So there is a revenue receipt, there is a revenue expenditure, and then in the revenue receipts you have tax revenues and non-tax revenues, right? So tax के ज़रिए जो government के किट्टी में जो आते हैं, that is tax revenue, and there are a lot of non-tax also. We will go a little more specific into the subsequent slides. तो ये जो non-tax revenue है. Then there is something called as plan expenditure and non-plan expenditure. It's given in the book, but if you look at it, government does not, budgets are not presented in terms of plan and non-plan now. When the planning commission was decommissioned, right, 2017 was the last 5-year plan that we had. So at that point in time, so planning commission was decommissioned and then Niti Aayog took over. तो जब आज की डेट में, एक ज़माने में जब प्लानिंग कमीशन होता था, तब प्लान एंड नॉन प्लान रेवेन्यू के बारे में बात करने में it makes sense. But however, you can think of it like this: the planned revenues are the ones which are projects that are anchored, proposed by Niti Aayog and all this, which have a little longer view, right? Longer strategic view, and non-plan are typical run-of-the-mill की country चलाने के लिए जो expenditure चाहिए, that is non-plan expenditure. Similarly, capital budget is long-term वाला. So you have capital receipts, something called as capital receipts, and capital expenditure. So capital expenditure भी plan and non-plan है, and we will get into a little more specifics into this in the subsequent slides. तो आप देखोगे तो it's a little similar to what we did. We're just going a little deeper into it. So what we look at is, so if I take so we have the budget here. The budget is split into, there is a receipt, and there's expenditure. What is coming in is receipt, हाथ में जो आ रहा है, right? घर में salary जो आ रही है वो receipt है, और जो हम खर्च कर रहे हैं वो expenditure है. That is the expenditure. So whenever you're talking about receipts, we've already said there are two possibilities. One is the receipt is either a revenue receipt or a capital receipt. And the revenue receipts broadly are tax and non-tax. In fact, tax is probably a significant part of the revenue receipt. I mean, the other receipts don't even give you more than 10-15% of the entire budget, but among the biggest chunk of the receipts is going to be the tax receipts. And tax में दो तरीके के हैं, एक है आपके direct taxes है और एक है आपके indirect taxes है. So direct taxes are things like income tax. You have a corporate tax, which is the tax that is imposed on the companies, firms, right? You have wealth tax, right? Other things, gift tax, so on, right? And then you have indirect tax. Indirect taxes are taxes that you impose on a person or any sale of good, any process of transaction, economic transaction on goods and services. And these taxes are priced into, right? आपके pricing में वो included है, लेकिन वो जो part है वो जाएगा government के लिए. So when somebody is selling it to you, वो tax add करके आपको बेच रहा है. You are anyway paying to the seller, and that part of the tax that the seller has collected, it goes to the government. So you have a sales tax, you have got customs duty, excise duty, service tax, right? So a lot of these taxes, I mean, you know, service tax is one very, very big reform that has happened over the, I mean, about 5 years back. And in this service tax, lots of taxes that used to be a part, right, have been removed. So there used to be things like value added tax, excise duty, all of that. So all of them have gone into something called as a service tax, and I mean, it's referred to as one of the biggest tax reforms. So basically you are going to apply service tax towards the end, and what it takes is at every point, wherever there's a value addition that is happening, there's a tax that is calculated on those value addition, and finally there is a tax that is imposed at the end. It has simplified the amount of work that tax officials have to do, and it also has simplified, or it's made the ease of doing business much more compared to what it was earlier. Of course, there are some things that do not still come under the service tax, like alcohol, petroleum, all those things. These things do not come under service tax. This is still taxed by the states. States will impose their own taxes. That is why you see that petroleum का जो price है, right? One of the reasons why petroleum also does not come under GST. So petroleum का जो price है, every state में अलग है. इसीलिए अलग है क्योंकि हर state का अलग tax इस पे लगता है. Then you have non-tax. Non-tax are, out of the non-tax, this interest payments is the biggest chunk, right? Close to about a very, very big chunk of this goes into the non-tax. And so non-tax, I correct myself, when you say interest payments by somebody else. I was referring to the interest payments when we do their expenditure. Interest payments is the biggest. I'll come to that later. But when you talk about non-tax interest payments receipt, government has given loan to somebody and that they are paying back the interest, that is referred to as. Then you have profits from the PSU firms. Government owns some companies. Unka jo profits hai, unka jo dividends hai, all these things come into the non-tax receipts. This is actually not much because the significant part of this is going to be taxes. Agar public sector units is imagine had they been doing a lot of profits, were they giving a lot of dividends to the government, this part would have been fairly big, but that's not the real, that's not the case. And then you have capital receipts में recovery of loans. आपने जो loan दिया है, right? आप उसको recover कर रहे हो, that is there. Disinvestment, public sector units, right? I mean, government is actually trying to disinvest in a lot of public sector units. क्यों? क्योंकि government believes कि वो business करना government की responsibility नहीं है, right? Once upon a time, government believed that it should take charge of manufacturing and many other things, because creating employment opportunities for the public was the main objective. That's why you will see that even today, government, आप government job सोचोगे या government sector सोचोगे, it's about आपको नौकरी मिल गई, बस आपको कोई निकाल नहीं सकता है. So that this is something that's been there for the last 40 odd years, where the prime responsibility of the government was to create jobs for the people, and which means creating jobs means कभी निकालेगा नहीं, right? Government doesn't ever remove people. So what's happening is, now government is saying that I must exit doing business. So they are disinvesting in business. Some of them they are disinvesting fully. Some of them, for example, Air India, they have given away completely, right? After so many years of attempts, they have managed to find a buyer, and Tatas have taken over Air India. Disinvestment could also be partial, right? Up 20%, 10%, 15%, up usko you are giving away, or disinvesting, you are giving away 20% of the ownership, 15% of the ownership to private enterprises who might be interested in that company. It is trying to do this for BPCL and other places. Okay, so that is called disinvestment. When it disinvests, it gets money, and that part of the money is also included. But problem in this is कि when you disinvest, government का जो assets है वो कम हो रहे हैं, right? Assets are becoming lesser. Then the other thing that comes in is borrowings. Borrowings is you take loans from various, government can take loans from various people. It could be from the domestic country, right? From the country itself, from the public. It could go to institutions and ask for loans. जैसे आपने पढ़ा होगा कि 1991 में जब liberalization हुआ था, the government did not have much of foreign exchange. Government had to take money from others. So it approached the IMF and said, please help me. IMF said, I will help you only under that conditions. That's how the liberalization started in India. So borrowings, right? Borrowings could be from countries, from international organizations like World Bank, IMF, so on. Now look at the expenditure part. Expenditure part is the revenue expenditure. So when I say revenue, remember this is revenue expenditure. Revenue expenditure is expenditure that happens to run the day-to-day part of the government. And what are the big things? As I said earlier, this is the maximum. This is the big chunk, right? Interest payments. Interest payments on the past loans. आपने अपने deficit को पूरी करने के लिए आपने so many years, 10 साल, 20 साल, जो भी आपने loans लिया है, उस loans का अभी भी हो सकता है interest payment चल रहा हो, right? कुछ चीज़ों का खत्म हो गया होगा, कुछ चीज़ों का interest payment चल रहा होगा. So the interest payment, right? Not the principal. Interest payment goes into this, and the principal goes into your capital expenditure. So this is the interest payment. Then you have salaries of so many people, government servants and all those people whom the government has a responsibility to pay, right? And then there is subsidies. Government also gives a lots of subsidies, right? It feels that suppose the fertilizer prices have to be kept low, right? Government tells the fertilizer company, आप इसको 100 rupees per kg पे नहीं, आप 60 rupees per kg पे बेचो, मैं आपको 40 rupees per kg देता हूँ, right? So that 40 rupees is subsidized by the government, and उसको that cost the government has to take. Then the defense. Defense is the committed. Come what may, you have to spend so much on defense. This is for the security of the country. So there is no discussion, but the discussion that will always happen is, it's not about whether you need to spend or not, it is about how much you spend. Is it going to be 5% of GDP, is going to be 2% of GDP, so on. उसके बाद है आपका कैपिटल एक्सपेंडिचर. कैपिटल एक्सपेंडिचर बहुत ही इंपॉर्टेंट है, राइट? अगर गवर्नमेंट डैम्स, रोड्स और जो कैपेसिटी बिल्डिंग वाली चीज़ें हैं उन पे अगर खर्च कर रहा हो, you will find that it is very good for the economy later, because these are going to help the economy in the future, right? So the infrastructure spending is one very important critical. जैसे you see that government is put a lot of money in 2021 post-COVID in order to prop up, create employment opportunities, create demand in the market, because COVID was such a big disaster for the economy. तो उसमें तो डिमांड बढ़ाने के लिए गवर्नमेंट यू स्पेंट अ लॉट ऑफ मनी ऑन द इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर और proposed in the budgets. Then you have financial assets. Sometimes government also owns, maybe it buys shares from some company and it is investing in it, right? No, if you look at some of the people who invest in India, some of them are the biggest sovereign funds. Sovereign funds का मतलब these are the funds owned by the government of Singapore, government of Abu Dhabi. All these people they own big companies in India. They own big share of companies in India. These are investment arms of the governments of the respective countries. So similarly, Indian government also has some investments in companies, so that's referred to as your financial assets or shares. Then loans, right? Loans, you are giving away loans, you are repaying loans, or you repaying principals of the loans, and these come in as your capital expenditure. So when we look at taxes, this part of it, it's very important to know that the kind of tax policies that the government does would be, there are two words that we use. One is called as progressive and the other is proportional. Progressive का मतलब जो ज़्यादा कमाता है, he must pay more tax. Very logical, right? Very fair. Similarly, proportional का मतलब there is some fraction of whatever you earn as profits that you must pay. That is what is used in corporate taxes. Indirect taxes का simple philosophy होता है, whenever you apply, even if you look at the sales tax ka structure, right, service tax ka structure, the ones that are necessary goods, the tax will be low. The ones that are luxury goods, the tax will be very high, right? Some things that are harmful for health and all that, right? For example, tobacco, right, alcohol and all these things, they will have a lot of tax. So the necessities, luxuries, semi-luxuries, tobacco and other products, they are things that will have different levels of taxation. उसके बाद जो revenue वाला जो है, it's obviously day-to-day thing. And then one thing about the capital expenditure is it reduces the liabilities, which means you're giving away loans, no more liabilities or reducing liabilities, and it creates assets like your infrastructure and financial assets. That's something that we have already seen. Now, fundamentally गवर्नमेंट का क्या रोल है? गवर्नमेंट क्या कर सकता है? जैसे बजट के थ्रू गवर्नमेंट का टू बहुत क्रिटिकल चीज़ें है, इट्स गवर्नमेंट स्पेंडिंग एंड गवर्नमेंट का जो टैक्सेशन पॉलिसीज. तो इन द लास्ट सेशन वी हैव सीन हाउ aggregate demand curve shifts when investment goes up or consumption, autonomous consumption goes up. So you find that the aggregate demand curve shifting enables that you get to a new equilibrium position जहाँ पे आपका national income ज़्यादा है. तो basically क्या है, government expenditure एक दो models है. एक model में आप you take the taxes as lump sum, the other is when you take it as progressive. Lump sum का मतलब, imagine that in that model you say that this is the amount of taxes that the government is going to collect. Progressive means if y is the income, right, a fraction of the y, right, some t into y will be your taxes that you impose. So when it increases d, which means the government expenditure is increasing, that shifts the curve upwards. Right? So if you have the aggregate demand curve like this, if this is the aggregate demand curve at a particular consumption level and investment level, if the G goes up, G increases, you see that this will shift upwards. So you see that what you had as an initial equilibrium position, and this is the new equilibrium position, the income is going up. So we know that the real GDP is the our x-axis and the aggregate demand is your y-axis. So this is how the government's investment or government's increase in its expenditure can shift your curve to the right and hence create some kind of a growth in the economy. Tax cuts also behave in a very similar manner. Tax cuts का मतलब आप tax को कम कर रहे हो, right? Tax rate आप कम कर रहे हो. जब आप tax rate कम करते हो, इसका मतलब ये हुआ कि जो disposable income है, right, लोगों के people have this disposable income in their hands, they have more income in their hands to spend. So wo jo spending will increase, and this spending will push the aggregate demand curve upwards. So the tax multiplier is negative. So we will talk about what exactly is a tax multiplier. So just quickly doing this equation part here, we can see that, let me take a different color ink. We can see that this is our aggregate demand, which is given by the consumption, autonomous consumption. C is the marginal propensity to consume, YD is the disposable income, then you have I is your investment, and G is your government expenditure. At equilibrium, we know that the value of goods and services produced, right, this is the planned supply, must be equal to the planned demand, right. So at this, when this happens, you will find that we get this equation, right. YD is given by this, we get this equation, and now if you kind of find out a differential on both sides, you will get delta Y, which is the change in the real GDP, is equal to C times delta, because this is these are all constants, right. This is a constant, right. C into TR is also a constant. If you assume the transfer payments as constant, I is constant, so you will find that if you keep these two as probable variables, you will find that we have delta Y by delta G would be equal to C by, sorry, 1 by 1 minus C, right. It's not C by 1 minus C, it's 1 by 1 minus C. You can see that this goes this side, and then that's how you get the multiplier effect. So if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, you will find that delta Y will be equal to 1 by 0.2 times delta G, which means for every $100 that the government increases as its expenditure, the income or the real GDP will go up by 500, change by 500. So this is when the government increases the expenditure. This is the case of government increasing the taxation. So it decides that I am going to increase the tax. I am going to fund my greater expenditure with, imagine you want to put taxes. So from this, if you look at it, you will get delta Y by delta T is equal to minus C by 1 minus C. So when we said that the tax multiplier is negative, this is what we mean by this. We mean by this that if you increase taxes, right, if you increase taxes, if delta Y is more, delta T is more, you increase taxes, then delta Y actually drops. If you cut taxes, if delta Y becomes negative, and then your delta T becomes negative, so your delta Y becomes positive. तो ये जो multiplier effect हमें, और एक और चीज़ हमको जो याद करना होता है कि आप मॉड्यूलस वैल्यू, द एब्सोल्यूट वैल्यू, इसका जो एब्सोल्यूट वैल्यू लोगे, this will be equal to C by 1 minus C, and you can see that the delta Y by G minus this, this is very obvious, right? This difference is always equal to 1. So it's something that you must kind of know, because this could come as a part of your objective question. The other thing is, for instance, if delta G is equal to delta T, which means the government says कि मैं जो अपना जो expenditure जो बढ़ाने वाला हूँ, I am going to use the increased taxes to take care of this expenditure. तो when that happens, you can see that this plus this, right? These two, this and this, right? Not the modulus part of it, just this part of it. When you add up those two, you get the value that is equal to 1. इसका मतलब क्या हुआ? इसका मतलब ये हुआ कि you find that the increase in, if you have a increase of 100 rupees in government expenditure, 100 rupees in increase in taxes, the income, the GDP of the country will also go up by 100. That is exactly what it means. So that's called a balanced budget multiplier. Now, what happens if you reduce taxes, proportional taxes, right? Reduction proportional taxes. And I'll just take this example here. So, what happens is, if I have a aggregate demand curve like this, and so if you look at the equation there, this is the equation. C bar, which is a consumption, which is constant, right? Autonomous consumption. Small c, your marginal propensity to come. 1 minus t, this is your tax rate, right? So, because that comes from here, this is the taxes that you're paying, right? The ty. So, whenever you talk about proportional taxes, we are obviously always referring to t is equal to ty. So, this is your disposable income mein y minus the taxes paid plus the transfer payments. So, when you kind of substitute this, you will find that the two things that you will get. One is, if you increase, whether it is increase of government expenditure or the autonomous consumption, you will find that the change in the income would be equal to 1 by 1 minus, this should be small c, into 1 minus t. तो ये जो this is the equation. So जब आप proportional taxes इंक्लूड करते हो, इनिशियली जब ये सी वाई था, राइट, अब ये हो गया c इंटू 1 माइनस टी इंटू वाई. इसका मतलब आपका जो स्लोप है नीचे हो गया. अगर स्लोप नीचे हो गया, इसका मतलब ये फ्लैट हो गया. It will become little more flat. So you will find that if you reduce the taxes, you will move to a new income. Just like if you increase the reduce the taxes in the other case too, the lump sum case, then also you will move to a new income. But it's just that you must remember that when you talk about proportional taxes are essentially taxes that are percentage of income. It lowers consumption at every level, because it is, you see, so much of taxes are being paid. It is not a lump sum at every level. As the income, as the economy's income goes up, you will find that the taxes that you are paying is going to go up, right? So it is changing at every income level. It reduces the marginal propensity to consume from C to C into 1 minus T. That's why this curve has become flatter. So in this case, remember, it is C into 1 minus T. Earlier it was C. C से C into 1 minus T हो गया. Effect of tax changes are smaller. क्यों? क्योंकि आपका marginal propensity to consume थोड़ा कम हो गया. इसका मतलब जो expenditure, right, जो consumption का जो effect है, right, that reduces by a factor, right? It is no longer C into T, it is C into 1 minus T. So it is that C part has become still smaller. So that's where we say that it acts like a automatic stabilizer. What do you mean by automatic stabilizer? It's like some kind of shock absorber. क्योंकि अगर GDP का impact on consumption जो है, वो उसको कम कराता है. कैसे कम कराएगा? For when you have GDP के वजह से consumption बढ़ रहा है, right? Whatever impact that is government expenditure or taxes आपने कम किया है, ठीक है, or government is pumping in money into the system. If the consumption goes up, right, but the consumption will not go as much up, so it will not heat up your economy, inflation will not be so much more, so it kind of helps reduce that a little bit. Similarly, recession में अगर consumption बिल्कुल गिर जाएगा, then the economy is likely to crash, because बहुत सारे firms, बहुत सारे companies को बंद करना पड़ेगा. But the moment the consumption does not reduce so much because of this smaller effect of marginal propensity to consume, it kind of acts like a shock absorber. इसीलिए हम उसको कहते हैं shock absorber. Government का increase होने से, I think this is very obvious कि government increase करेगा तो ये this will go up, right? Whether it is in the case of a lump sum tax or proportional tax, और जिसकी वजह से आपका economy will actually shift to a new position जहाँ पे आपका real GDP actually goes up. If investment drops, government discretionary policy stabilizes the economy. If generally in the investment, when will investment drop? When the private sector does not see demand coming in, they don't want to invest more. So government has to prop up. So in order to do that, government might increase its expenditure, and this need to increase the government expenditure, right, comes as a policy which is a discretion of the government. Just say COVID, during COVID, government spent humongous amount of money. It's not just in India, across the world. All governments have pumped in so much money because the demand dropped significantly. Firms, companies, right, everything would have closed down. In order to kind of prop up demand, government spent a lot of money across the world. Welfare transfers also stabilize income to an extent. In boom times, you see that welfare expenditure exerts stabilizing pressure on high consumption, and in the slums, welfare expenditure spurs consumption. So, giving out, COVID is a classic example of how welfare expenditure spurs consumption during cases of slump, right? Government gave away money, in fact, a lot of people got money to buy things because people had lost their jobs. So, if you get back to doing the equation part, right, you see that this is your aggregate demand curve, and when you look at the change in the autonomous expenditure, that is what it is. And then look at the change in a government in the case of, you see that they are exactly the same. These two are same, right? If you want to remember it, these are one and the same. However, if the government decides to do a little bit of transferring, right? So this should be small c. Transfers, right? Which means, what do you mean by transfer? Government is giving you money, not in exchange for any service that you have provided. It is just giving money, unemployment benefit, something like that, right? So the delta y by delta t in that case will be equal to c by 1 minus c. It is very similar to your minus c by 1 minus c in the case of taxation. It just works the ulta, right? You remember the lump sum tax that we talked about? That's what we did. तो बजट की बात तो हमने कर ली, ठीक है? I mean, this is exactly what we saw earlier. Oh, sorry. But there are a few things that we need to talk about the budget. So let me focus on those things first. One is something called as a revenue budget, revenue deficit or revenue surplus. But surplus or deficit depends on what is the difference between your receipts and expenditure. That's what simply it is. So when we take C, right, which is your revenue receipts minus E, revenue expenditure, when you only focus on revenue receipts and revenue expenditure, and you take sum of all these that is coming into the kitty, sum of all this that is going out of your pocket, इसका जो difference है, अगर वो नेगेटिव है उसको हम कहते हैं डेफिसिट, अगर वो पॉजिटिव है उसको हम कहते हैं सरप्लस. सो दिस इज योर. द सेकेंड इज, नाउ व्हाट डज दिस इंडिकेट? दिस इंडिकेट्स दैट जो आपको रेगुलरली आ रहा है पैसे और जो आप डे टू डे खर्च कर रहे हो, अगर इसमें जो नेगेटिव होगा, आई थिंक इट्स वेरी डेंजरस पोजिशन. आप व्हाट यू आर डूइंग इज टू रन योर, आई मीन इट्स लाइक इन योर फैमिली, टू रन योर डे टू डे थिंग इन द फैमिली, you are short of money, right? What would you do? You will keep taking loans from people, and at some point in time it's going to kind of explode. That's exactly what happens in a country, though it's a little different because country mein the government has the ability to print money, take loans and all other things. Fiscal deficit or fiscal surplus, which is jo aapne we are going to look at this at a bigger picture. So you see this is B, you could think of it, B minus A minus B expenditure, the total expenditure of the government, minus A, the total receipts of the government, right? अगर expenditure is more than this, obviously it is a deficit. अगर expenditure is less than this, this is surplus. But in addition to this, we take away DA and DB. Which is DA? This part, recovery of loans, and DB. Because this should ideally, even this must tell me that this money is actually coming in and helping out bridge the gap, right? So when you remove these two also from the total deficit that you have, This kind of tells you कि fiscal deficit tells you कि अच्छा जितना भी जहाँ से मैं बटोरना चाहूँ पैसे, वो मैंने तो बटोर लिया, अब मुझे इस डेफिसिट को फाइनेंस करने के लिए I have to go and take loans. There is no other option. So this tells you the need, how much to borrow. Primary deficit, on the other hand, is saying that, okay, if I take the fiscal deficit, from the fiscal deficit take out what you have as the interest payments, right? Expenditure जो interest payments है, okay, you take out this as interest payments, and that will kind of give you a sense of what exactly is the primary deficit. So ideally this should be expenditure wala payments, क्योंकि आप क्या कर रहे हो, basically you are saying that I want to see, so make this correction, this should be EA, because what you are fundamentally saying is I don't want to see how much I am paying as interest. जो deficit, primary deficit जो है, it is basically saying आप कैसे चला पा रहे हो country without the interest thing. अगर प्राइमरी डेफिसिट में भी आपकी डेफिसिट है, बड़ा सा डेफिसिट है, इसका मतलब यू आर जस्ट नॉट एबल टू मैनेज, राइट, विदाउट लुकिंग एट द इंटरेस्ट पेमेंट्स दैट्स गोइंग डे टू डे, बेसिक थिंग्स, इवन द नॉर्मल थिंग्स यू आर नॉट एबल टू मैनेज. सो दैट इज ए वेरी वेरी dangerous thing to have when the primary deficit is high. Now interpretations of deficit क्या है? If you look at the three deficits, revenue deficit, I said कि basically you're taking money to do current current expenses. So current income, expenditure, you're basically dissaving, you're financing consumption. What are you doing in revenue? You're day to day job के लिए आप you're taking loan from people. So when you take loan from people now, you end up building a lot of debt, right, and the interest liabilities, and this ends up becoming a committed expenditure for the future. You are passing this on to the future generation to take care of your आज की जो consumption है. It's not as if you are spending money on capital projects which will be useful to the future generation. फ्यूचर जनरेशन को कोई भी यूज़ नहीं होने वाला है. आप आज का जो रिक्वायरमेंट्स है उसको to just take care of that, you are taking loans from people. Capital and welfare expenditure sacrifice in the future. So this is one criticism that we have about high revenue expenditures. Then we are talking about gross fiscal deficit. Gross fiscal deficit is total expenditure minus the revenue receipts minus the debt creating capital receipts, non-debt creating capital receipts. So when you take away all of this, it's a key indicator of financial health and stability of the economy. So basically it's saying that if the fiscal deficit is high, you are going to finance this through borrowing. You have to go to the people and borrow money, and the indicated borrowing, if you look at it, requirements, this gives you what the government has to do, how much the government has to borrow. It could be from home, domestic markets, it could be you go abroad, or it could be from your RBI. So these are the three options of the government to have to fund its deficit. तो home borrowings, obviously we have seen कि banking system से आ सकता है, जो SLR को आप tweak करने से, SLR बढ़ाने से आप कह रहे हो banks को कि अभी government इसमें आप ज़्यादा पैसे लगाओ, right? Or it could be public debt schemes, it could be your post office schemes, or any scheme that the government is launching जहाँ पे आप invest कर रहे हो. So this is a fairly big part of your revenue. If the revenue deficit is a big part of the fiscal deficit, danger for the country, right? So basically you're saying that whatever we are doing as borrowing, we are trying to take, or we are taking loans to take care of the current requirements, current consumption, what is valuable to you for this year, not for subsequent years. Primary deficit is FD minus the net interest liabilities, estimate of the current expenditure minus the revenue imbalance. It basically gives you an idea saying that don't talk to me about जो इंटरेस्ट पेमेंट्स आपको करनी है वो आपका हटा दो, आप कितना डेफिसिट है. अगर वो कहता है नो this even though we have a fairly big deficit, it's very dangerous because that's going to make it worse. The net interest payments that you're going to pay or include, that will make this deficit much worse. So broadly 3 areas है. जैसे deficit financing means deficit को कैसे government fill up कर देता है. So that is finance कैसे करता है. एक तो 3 है, basically 3 areas. One is through taxation, the other is borrowing from others. This is referred to as government debt. And then तीसरी चीज जो है which the government has the luxury of and you and I don't have, that is called as printing money. You can print money. In fact, during COVID, I think all governments all over the world have actually done a lot of printing of money. So there is what happens when you accumulate debt, right? आप जब लोन लेती है, government जब लोन लेती है, तो how does that impact? So basically what you are doing is you are transferring your burden to the next generation, which means आप कह रहे हो कि 10 साल बाद ये इसको पे करना होगा, तो आज मेरा प्रॉब्लम तो सॉल्व हो गया, बट वो जो 10 साल बाद जो जिसको पे करना है, that generation will have a problem, right? And how would it have a problem? You will have to increase your expenditure, you would have to increase taxes some way, that if there is not enough growth, you'll have to increase taxes to pay the interest that we have because of the loans that our generation has taken. That generation that comes much later, they have to pay taxes, and because of which their savings will be reduced, and that will impact the country in a significant way. The second thing is it reduces what is called as the credit availability of private sectors and hence capital formation and growth. Government आके बहुत सारा debt through from the domestic market उठा लेता है, बाकी जो private sector है उसके पास either they don't have enough credit that they can take, or maybe the interest rates have gone up so that it becomes costly. So what you are depriving, this is called as crowding out the private borrowing. It impacts capital formation and growth because what is the government doing it for? Government is doing it for taking this day-to-day expenses. So it's a very dangerous thing to do. Budget deficit, so there is something called as Ricardian equivalence, right? Basically, Ricardian equivalence basically says that David Ricardo is a very, very famous economist, right? He believed that the high deficit leads to greater savings, and G increases through if there's an increase in the government spending, and that is happening through borrowing. This is equivalent to, this is where the equivalence comes in. This is equivalent to the government increasing a situation where the government increases finance through taxes. So whether it is through borrowing or whether it is through taxes, you'll find that both of them behave in a similar manner. So it is like saying this, right? Where it might actually completely here we are saying that if you are reducing taxes, I mean you are actually trying to prop up the economy by reducing taxes, right? It behaves very similarly to trying to increase demand through deficit financing in our budget deficits. So government is saying, I will use budget deficit as a tool to increase my economic growth, is very similar to how this the economy works through reduced taxation. We've seen this earlier too, right? So Ricardian equivalence, right, actually is talking about in the times of very high deficit, right, very counterintuitively, right, might lead to greater savings, right? High deficit, इसका मतलब government is spending more, the expectation is consumption will be more, savings will be less. But what Ricardo said is, शायद ये नहीं होगा, right? ये होगा कि in times of high deficit, if the people are also intelligent, they know कि अच्छा high deficit है, taxes badega baad mein, let me save it now, inflation hoga. And so he believes that the general sense of common sense or intelligence that the public has, that leads to greater savings. The criticisms of budget deficit has always been that, one, it is inflationary, right? But not because you are increasing the aggregate demand, but ये ज़रूरी नहीं कि हमेशा inflationary होगा, क्योंकि अगर जो money that is spent, if it is spent on capital intensive stuff, right, things that will create productive capacities in the future, if there is a lot of capital investment going and the deficit that you have is used to fund all those, expend in all those projects, that is a very, very critical thing to keep in mind. Because in that case, you may not actually have inflation. It could be fine because then you are increasing the productive capacity and the demand supply gap will not be so much in the economy. But however, what also happens is one of the major criticisms is it is crowding out of private players in the market. This is where if the government is spending it on things that improve growth in the future, then maybe this criticism may not be so valid. However, if the government is taking out debt to finance its revenue expenses, then I think it's very dangerous for the future. Now, reduction in deficits. How is the government trying to reduce deficits? So, एक है कि government is, when it's trying to kind of look at taxes, rationalizing taxes, trying to increase collection through taxes. It's not about you increase the rate of taxes, but try to increase collection through taxes. And greater reliance is always done on trying to bring more and more people into the direct taxation, because this is not regressive. What do you mean by regressive? Something that is bad. So indirect taxes are bad because it affects everybody. If you increase indirect taxes, the prices of all goods and commodities will go up, and hence you will find that it is going to affect everybody. Whereas direct taxes will only affect the people who have at a certain higher income levels. Disinvestment, this has been a focus. Get more and more, kind of sell off more PSUs and see if you can get out of this business of running companies. The very important thing is how do you reduce expenditure, and that can happen through efficiencies, right? It can happen through cash transfers, it can happen through reducing government activities in certain areas. There are some very areas जहाँ पे government को होना ही नहीं चाहिए था, but they end up doing that and hence spending a lot of money. ये जो cash transfers की बात है, so we talked about Jan Dhan scheme and all that. So what the government found is, in order to give a person a benefit of 1 rupee, it was spending 3.5 rupees to do the same thing. तो government कहता है कि अच्छा ये सब करने की क्या ज़रूरत है? I will give that 1 rupee directly to the person's bank account. That is where your Jan Dhan scheme, financial inclusion are extremely important. It can reduce the government's expenditure significantly. Deficits increase in times of recession and falls in times of boom. This is something that we see in the current, the reason being the way the government, I mean, if you look at the way COVID has happened, the general demand for all goods and commodities has dropped, and since that is dropped, why did that drop? Because people have saved less, or they want to save more and they want to consume less, and in those times the government has to come and do a balancing act to take care of the to make sure that aggregate demand actually shifts upwards. Now, क्योंकि गवर्नमेंट्स का ये आदत है कि पॉलिटिकली वो सब कुछ सही करे, राइट? सारे पॉपुलर मेजर्स, पैसे उड़ा दो, ठीक है, नॉट वरी अबाउट व्हाट हैपेंस in the future. In order to take care of that, there was something called as FRBMA Act that was instituted in 2003. So it is more about managing your finances and managing budgets very effectively in order that you have a more healthier economy. So this is notified in 2004, and it's a prudent fiscal policy, इसका मतलब ये हम कह रहे हैं कि we are trying to be very very prudent, right, to negate political decisions and to ensure that our long intergenerational in future में people don't kind of say कि आपने क्या कर दिया है, right? I mean, why have you spoiled our present? So in order to make sure that there is stability in the future too, this FRBMA Act comes into picture. So it basically talks about a few things. It says कि आपके जो borrowing limits and all those things, you must take control of borrowing and also take control of your deficits. Revenue surplus लाने की कोशिश करना चाहिए, right? And this is something that's a challenge for all the governments. Removing obstacles to monetary policy and also effective debt management. And there are a few standard things that they talk about. So let's look at reduce fiscal deficit to less than 3% of GDP. Eliminate revenue deficit by March 31st, 2009. A lot of these things have actually been revised, but I'm talking about what's there in the book because I think that's you must stick to, and create a revenue surplus. But this is, I mean, even today when you look at the budget, I think everybody in all discussions are, अच्छा budget का level कितना है? 3% है, 3.2% है, 3.5% है, 4% है, right? During COVID, it's really shot through. Reduction in fiscal deficit by about 0.3%, revenue deficit by 0.5% every year, through tax or expenditure control. Actual deficit has to be greater than targets, right? We must try to make sure that you exceed the targeted deficits only in the case of some security issue or some calamity or some very exceptional grounds. Otherwise, it says try to stick to your targets. Government not to borrow from RBI except as a temporary advance, cash imbalances. So what they want is RBI should not be the first person who is very willing to give government debt, क्योंकि वो आदत पड़ जाती है और वो जो indiscipline से financial indiscipline आ जाती है. And the other things is transparency in fiscal operations. I think this is very very important. This is where IT comes into picture. A lot of things, if you're able to create transparent. There are 3 policy statements that it wants, FRBMA Act expects the finance minister to give out at the end of every budget, right? And there is a quarterly review that must happen where the ministry must give its statement. So what are the 3 statements that the finance minister has to give? एक कहते हैं हम medium term fiscal policy statement, 3-year rolling, क्या होने वाला है? You're basically finance minister saying कि क्या होने वाला है? He or she is going to give some indicators about revenue deficit कैसे होने वाली है, fiscal deficit, tax to GDP क्या होगा, outstanding debt क्या है, right? These are the broad parameters or these are the indicators on which the government, the finance minister is going to make statements. Can revenue expenditure be financed through revenue receipts? This is the target, क्योंकि हमको revenue surplus चाहिए, right? So क्या ये possible है? Finance minister must be able to say कि हाँ possible है या नहीं है. Productive usage of capital receipts, कैसे use कर रहे हैं capital receipts? How productively are we using it? Then there are other 2 statements. One is a fiscal policy strategy statement. You must know all these things, right? Basically, the government is going to say priorities क्या है, deviations अगर कुछ हुआ है, उसका क्या justification है? Why did we move away from our targets? Then there is something called as macroeconomic framework statement. So it is basically talking about your assessment of growth rate. क्या होने वाला है? What is the expected growth rate, right? And fiscal and external balance of your central government. So it's a broad view, and these are statements that the finance minister must give in order to give everybody a sense of direction where the economy is moving. So that kind of brings us to the end of this very important chapter. My expectation is this chapter will have about 7 to 8 questions. You must know very basic deficits, you must know capital account, revenue accounts, whether it is expenditure or this, and I could give you some expense and ask you where do you think it will go into, and a little bit about FRBM Act. Please do note it and make sure that you do the exercise that follows this and look at the solutions. Thank you.